Preface. There are few successful commanders, says Creasy, on whom fame has shone so unwillingly as upon John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough. I believe this is true, and it is an interesting historical study to examine the causes which have made so great a contrast between the glory and importance of his deeds and the small regard of his countrymen for his memory. He commanded the armies of Europe against France for 10 campaigns. He fought 4 great battles and many important actions. It is the common boast of his champions that he never fought a battle that he did not win, nor besieged a fortress he did not take. Amid all the chances and baffling accidents of war, he produced victory with almost mechanical certainty. Even when fighting in fetters and hobbles, swayed and oppressed by influences which were wholly outside the military situation, he was able to produce the same result, varying only in degree. Nothing like this can be seen in military annals. His smaller campaigns were equally crowned by fortune. He never rode off any field except as a victor. He quitted war invincible, and no sooner was his guiding hand withdrawn than disaster overtook the armies he had led. Successive generations have not ceased to name him, with Hannibal and Caesar. Until the advent of Napoleon, no commander wielded such widespread power in Europe. Upon his person centred the union of nearly 20 Confederate states. He held the Grand Alliance together no less by his diplomacy than by his victories. He rode into action with the combinations of 3/4 of Europe in his hand. His comprehension of the war extended to all theatres, and his authority alone secured design and concerted action. He animated the war at sea no less than on land, and established till the present time the British naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. His eye ranged far across the oceans, and the foundations of British dominion in the New World and in Asia were laid or strengthened as a result of his continental policy. He was for 6 years not only the commander-in-chief of the Allies, but though a subject, virtually master of England. He was head of the most glorious administration in her history, when he led Europe, saved the Austrian Empire, and broke irretrievably the exorbitant power of France. The union with Scotland was but a feature of a period in which our country made its greatest advances in world rank and fame. In 1688, Europe drew swords in a quarrel which, with one uneasy interlude, was to last for 1/4 of a century. Since the duel between Rome and Carthage, there has been no such world war. It involved all the civilized peoples. It extended to every part of the accessible globe. It settled for some time or permanently the relative wealth and power and the frontiers of almost every European state. It outlined their various inheritances to the new domains beyond the ocean. In its course, it drew out, matched and exhausted the life energies of the nations in the same way, though not of course with the same scientific thoroughness as did the Great War, through which we ourselves have passed. Indeed, there are other remarkable similarities between this period and the beginning of the 20th century. There was the same peril that the supremacy of one race and culture would be imposed by military force upon all others. There was the impotence of Europe without British aid, the slow but sure acceptance by England of the challenge and the call, and the same tremendous increasing development of British effort during the struggle. The wars of William and Anne were no mere effort of national ambition or territorial gain. They were in essentials a struggle for the life and liberty not only of England, but of Protestant Europe. Marlborough's victorious sword established, upon sure foundations, the constitutional and parliamentary structure of our country, almost as it had come down to us today. He carried all that was best in the life work of Oliver Cromwell and William III to an abiding conclusion. In no world conflict have the issues, according to modern standards, been more real and vital. In none has the duty to defend a righteous cause been more compulsive upon the British nation. In none have the results been more solid, more precious, more lasting. The triumph of the France of Louis XIV would have warped and restricted the development of the freedom we now enjoy, even more than the domination of Napoleon or of the German Kaiser. It is usually pretended that Marlborough's personal affections followed his worldly interests and changed sides and agents with them. He certainly abandoned King James and quarrelled with King William. But apart from these two sovereigns around whom ranged some of the supreme constitutional and religious struggles of our history, and in whose circle business of state overrode private attachments, his character shows an astonishing constancy. His romantic love for his wife Sarah during nearly 50 years of wedlock, his fidelity to the princess and queen he served without a break for the 30 years from 1682 to 1712 were the keynotes of his life. His main friendships and political connections were proof against all the stresses and surprises of violent times, when nothing was sure or safe. He worked in steady and mutual confidence with Halifax, Shrewsbury, Russell and Legg for a generation. Godolphin was his close friend and ally for 40 years. Death alone severed these ties. The same elements of stability and continuity marked his great period. The 10 years of war with their hazards, their puzzles, their ordeals, their temptations, only strengthened a brotherhood in arms with Prince Eugene, unmatched between captains of equal fame. Not all the wear and tear of the Grand Alliance, nor the ceaseless friction between England and Holland, disturbs his similar association with the pensionary Heinsius. Cardigan was his chief staff officer, and Cardinal his secretary, through all his campaigns, and both shared his fortunes and misfortunes to the end. Yet fame shines unwillingly upon the statesman and warrior whose exertions brought our island, and all Europe, safely through its perils, and produced glorious results for Christendom. A long succession of the most famous writers of the English language have exhausted their resources of reproach and insult upon his name. Swift, Pope, Thackeray and Macaulay, in their different styles, have vied with one another in presenting an odious portrait to posterity. Macpherson and Dalrymple have fed them with misleading or mendacious facts. Neither of the two historic British parties have been concerned to defend Marlborough's national action. Every taunt, however bitter, every tale, however petty, every charge, however shameful, for which the incidents of a long career could afford a pretext, has been levelled against him. He in his lifetime remained silent, offering or leaving behind him no explanation or excuse, except his deeds. Yet these have sufficed to gather around him a literature more extensive than belongs to any military commander who was not also a sovereign. Hundreds of histories and biographies have been written about him and his wife Sarah. Many have been maliciously hostile, and others have destroyed their effect through undiscriminating praise. Many more have been meritorious, but unread. It is only within recent times that the new school of writers, who are reconciling scientific history with literary style and popular comprehension, have begun to make headway against the prejudice of 200 years. It is with a sense of deep responsibility that I have attempted the task of making John Churchill intelligible to the present generation. Many of his defenders have shown the highest ability and immense learning, but their voices have not prevailed against the prestige and art of his assailants. When in the closing months of his life, Macaulay was challenged in his facts, in his methods and in his bias by the brilliant but unknown Paget, he felt strong enough to treat the most searching correction and analysis with contempt. Posterity, he reflected, would read what he himself had written. His critics, if he but ignored them, would soon be forgotten. It may perhaps be so, but time is a long thing. I hesitated about undertaking this work, but two of the most gifted men I have known urged me to it strongly. Lord Balfour, with all the rare refinement of his spacious mind, cool, questioning, critical, pressed it upon me with compelling enthusiasm. Lord Rosebery said, "Surely you must write Duke John," as he always called him. He was a tremendous fellow. I said that I had from my childhood read everything I came across about him, but that Macaulay's story of the betrayal of the expedition against Brest was an obstacle I could not face. The aged and crippled statesman arose from the luncheon table and with great difficulty, but sure knowledge, made his way along the passages of the Durdans to the exact note in the capacious working library where Paget's Examen reposed. There, he said, take down this unknown out-of-print masterpiece, is the answer to Macaulay. Paget's defence of the Camaret Bay letter has been judged valid by modern opinion. As these pages will show, I could not be satisfied with it. Paget in fact proved that Marlborough's alleged letter, betraying to the Jacobite court the Brest expedition, could only have been written after he knew that it had been betrayed already and could do no harm. My researchers have convinced me that the document purporting to be a letter is a fabrication, and that no such letter exists or ever existed. The argument upon this point occupies about 4 chapters of this volume. Upon this issue I joined battle. I believe that the Jacobite records preserved in the Scots College in Paris are one of the greatest frauds of history. They are nothing more than the Secret Service reports of Jacobite agents and spies in England. It is astonishing that so many famous writers should have accepted them to traduce not merely Marlborough, but the entire generation of statesmen and warriors of William and Anne, who bore England forward in the world as she has never been born before or since. It is an aberration of historical technique. In a portrait or impression, the human figure is best shown by its true relation to the objects and scenes against which it is thrown, and by which it is defined. I have tried to unroll a ribbon of English history which stretches along the reigns of Charles II, James II, William and Mary, William III, and Anne. The ribbon is always of equal width. Through it runs the scarlet thread of John Churchill's life. In this volume, we trace that thread often with difficulty and interruption. It slowly broadens until for a goodly lap it covers the entire history of our country and frays out extensively into the history of Europe. Then it will narrow again as time and age impose their decrees upon the human thrust. But the ribbon is meant to continue at its even spread. I feel that for one reason or another, an opportunity will be accorded to me to state in a manner which will receive consideration Marlborough's claim to a more just and more generous judgment from his fellow countrymen. In this work, I am compelled before reaching the great period of his life to plough through years of struggle and to meet a whole host of sneers, calamities, and grave accusations. The court is attentive, and I shall not be denied audience. It is my hope to recall this great shade from the past, and not only invest him with his panoply, but make him living and intimate to modern eyes. I hope to show that he was not only the foremost of English soldiers, but in the first rank among the statesmen of our history. Not only that he was a Titan, for that is not disputed, but that he was a virtuous and benevolent being, eminently serviceable to his age and country, capable of drawing harmony and design from chaos, and one who only needed an earlier and still wider authority to have made a more ordered and more tolerant civilization for his own time, and to help the future. My cousin, the present Duke of Marlborough, has placed the Blenheim papers at my disposal. Earl Spencer and many custodians of the treasures of the bygone years have shown me the utmost consideration. To them I all express my gratitude. Also to Professor Trevelyan, who may think some sentences I have written about Macaulay a poor return for his historical reparations. But I can faithfully declare I have sought the truth. I have profited greatly from my conversations with Mr. Keith Failing, whose authority on his period stands so high. I am much indebted to Mr. M.P. Ashley, who for the last 4 years has conducted my researches into the original manuscripts at Blenheim and Althorpe, as well as in Paris, Vienna and London, and has constantly aided me in reading and revising the text. His industry, judgment and knowledge have led to the discovery of various errors, and also of some new facts which are not included in the current versions of Marlborough's life. We have tried to test all documents and authorities at the source. Nevertheless, we await with meekness every correction or contradiction which the multiplicate knowledge of students and critics will supply. Chapter 1. Ash House, 1644 to 1661. In January 1644, a Devonshire lady, Eleanor, or Ellen, widow of Sir John Drake, alarmed by the royalist activities in the West Country, had asked for a Roundhead garrison to protect her house at Ash, near Axminster. She was of good affection to that parliament, had aided them with money and provisions, and had animated her tenants in 7 adjoining parishes to adhere to their cause. The troops were sent, But before they could fortify the place, Lord Powlet, a neighbour who commanded for the king, marched upon it with Irish soldiers, drove out the parliamentarians, burned her house, and stripped the good lady who, almost naked and without shoe to her foot, but what she afterwards begged, fled to Lyme for safety. Here she entered fresh hardships. The Roundhead seaport of Lyme Regis was soon attacked by the royal forces. Early in April, Prince Maurice, with 6,000 men and an excellent artillery, laid siege to the town. The story of its resolute defence is a cameo of the Civil War. For nearly 3 months, a primitive, fitful, fierce combat was waged along and across the meagre ramparts and ditches which protected the townsfolk. Women aided the garrison in their stubborn defence, relieving them in their watch by night and handing up the powder and ball in action. Colonel Blake, afterwards the famous Admiral of the Commonwealth, commanded the town. He several times offered the Royalists to open a breach in his breastworks and fight out the issue face to face on a front of 20 or on a front of 10 men. His leadership and 26 sermons by an eloquent Puritan divine sustained the courage of the defenders. They depended for their supplies upon the sea. From time to time ships came in sight and aroused hopes and fears in both camps. Lady Drake was for a while in extreme distress. She must have watched the coming of ships with mingling feelings. The Royalist Navy, such as it was commanded by her sister's grandson, James Leigh, 3rd Earl of Marlborough. Every week it was rumoured that her dreaded relation would arrive from the Channel Islands with reinforcements for the enemy. But he never came. The Parliament held the seas. Only Roundhead ships appeared. Eleanor endured privations, bombardments, and burnings for nearly 3 months. She was for her livelihood reduced to the spinning and knitting of stockings, in which miserable condition she continued until the siege of Lyme was raised by the arrival of a relieving Puritan army from London under the Earl of Essex, whereof she got away and came to Parliament. Her son John was no help to her in her misfortunes. We have been assured that he was loyal to the king and on bad terms with his Puritan mother. But this seems incorrect. He was on the contrary at this time himself a prisoner of war in Prince Maurice's hands, and it was his mother who exerted herself on his behalf. Her sister, the Countess of Marlborough, stood high with the Royalists and appealed for the release of the captive. But the parliamentary forces were now moving towards Axminster, and as the young Drake had said imprudently that he would get Lord Powlet's house burned in revenge for the burning of Ash, his liberation was not unnaturally refused. Lady Drake, though a resolute Puritan, continued to address herself to both sides, invoking with the Royalists her sisters and with the Roundheads her own political merit. On the 28th of September 1644, Parliament ordered that being wholly ruined by the enemy forces, she should have a furnished house in London rent-free, £100 at once and £5 a week. The Westminster Commissioners accordingly 4 days later selected for her the house of a Royalist gentleman then still in arms, Sir Thomas Raynal, and she remained in these quarters for nearly 4 years, pursuing her claims for compensation through the slow-working mills of Westminster. Sir Thomas made his peace with Parliament and compounded for, that is ransomed, his house in 1646. He demanded reinstatement, as was his right, and he complained that Lady Drake during her tenancy had digged up the ground and pulled up the floors in search of treasure. Nevertheless, she continued to reside there in his despite, and perseveringly pursued her case against Lord Powlet for the burning of Ash, and she had sufficient credit with the now irresistible parliamentarians to carry it at last to a conclusion in the spring of 1648, where she was awarded £1,500 compensation to be paid out of Lord Powlet's estate. It had taken Eleanor 4 years to secure the award. 2 years more were required to extract the money from the delinquent, upon whose rents, meanwhile, she had a virtual receivership. In July 1650, she complained to Parliament that Lord Powlet still owed her £600. A further laborious investigation was set on foot. 6 years passed after the burning of Ash, which she claimed had lost her £6,000, before Lady Drake recovered her £1,500 compensation. She had need of it, and indeed of every penny. Hers was a family divided against itself by the wars. Her son fought for the Parliament. Her son-in-law, Winston Churchill, fought for the king. Both he and his father had taken arms in the royal cause from the early days. Both in turn, the father first, were drawn into the clutches of the Parliament. The Dorsetshire Standing Committee, which dealt with the cases of the local royalists, reports in its minutes that in April 1646, John Churchill, a lawyer of some eminence of Wootton Glanville, near Sherborne, had stated before them that he had formerly been nominated a commissioner for the king, but he pleaded that in November 1645 he had taken the National Covenant and the negative oath. He had paid £300 for the parliamentary garrison at Weymouth and £100 on account of his personal estate. Moreover, reported the committee, he was 60 years of age and unable to travel. In these circumstances, in August 1646, he was fined £440, and a month later, the sequestration of his estates was suspended. The reckoning with his son Winston was delayed. Joining the king's army at 22, he had made some mark upon the battlefields. He had become a captain of horse, and his bearing had been noted in the fights at Lansdowne Hill and Roundway Down. He was a youthful, staunch, and bigoted adherent of the king. Towards the end of 1645 he was wounded, and his plight amid the Roundheads, now victorious throughout Dorset and Devon, was most awkward. However, he had a refuge among the enemy. His father's house at Wootton Glanville was only a day's ride from Ash. He was married to Lady Drake's third daughter, Elizabeth. No one has hitherto been able to fix the date of the marriage, or whether it took place before or during the civil wars. The Chancery records, however, state that in October 1649, Winston and his wife Elizabeth sued Sir Henry Rosewell, one of the executors of Sir John Drake, for part of his inheritance, due to her when she was 21. From this case it appears that Sir John died in October 1636, and Elizabeth was 21 in February 1644, and that she married in May of that same year. We know that a formal settlement was made between Winston's father and Lady Drake, giving Elizabeth a dowry of £1,500. As John Drake had at least 4 daughters, all of whom were left a similar capital in land, besides the estates left to his widow and son, the Drakes were evidently a substantial family. It is remarkable that such contracts should have been effected between persons so sharply divided by the actual fighting of the civil wars. We can see the stresses of the times from the fact that Winston's first child, Arabella, of whom more later, was not born till 1649, or more than 5 years after the date of the marriage, although thereafter children were born almost every year. No doubt the couple were parted by the severities of the war, and did not live regularly together till the struggle in the western counties was ended. It is probable that Elizabeth lived with her mother during the whole of the fighting, and that from about the beginning of 1646, Winston joined her there. At any rate, from that time forward, the two young people, wedded across the lines of civil war, lay low in the ruins of Ash, and hoped to remain unnoticed or unpersecuted until the times should mend. For a while, all went well, but a regular system of informers had been set on foot, and despite Winston's Roundhead connections and Lady Drake's influence and record, the case against him was not allowed to lapse. At the end of 1649, he was charged with having been a captain in the King's army. According to the Dorsetshire records, witnesses, greedy, interested, but nonetheless credible, certified that as late as December 1645, Winston was still in the field against the Parliament, that he had been shot through the arm by the forces under Colonel Starr, and that he had resisted to the end with the royal garrison at Bristol. None of these facts could be rebutted. However, the processes of law continued to work obstinately in spite of war and revolution. Beaten foes had rights which, unless specifically abolished by statute, they could assert. The delinquent captain fell back upon the law. He sought to collect debts owing to him from others. He claimed that 1,000 marks given to his wife by her father, the late Sir John Drake, could not be sequestered. He laboured to put off the day when the final sentence would be pronounced. long delays resulted. By August 1650, the parliamentary authorities had lost patience. Some cases, say their records, are sued out for no other end but to protract time, as that of Winston Churchill, who, it seems by his order, presented his father, John Churchill, and Lady Ellen Drake, had no interest in his portion, whereas he has still a suit depending against Colonel William Fry and Sir Henry Rosewell in his own name. Only for his wife's portion, had anyone else a title to it, he would not have commenced such a suit. As to his being in arms, he will surely not so far degenerate from his principles as to deny it. Nevertheless, it was not till April the 29th, 1651, that the Commissioners for Compounding finally ordered that Winston Churchill of Wootton Glanville, in the county of Dorset, do pay as a fine for his delinquents the sum of £440, whereof £446 18 is to be paid into the Treasury at Goldsmiths Hall, and the £33 2 received already by our Treasurer Mr. Dawson of Sir Henry Rosewell, in part of the money owing by him to John Churchill, father of the said Winston, is hereby allowed of us, in part of the said £440. Once a statement gets into the stream of history, it is apt to flow on indefinitely. In Hutchins' History of Dorset, published in 1774, this sum of £446 18 is by a misprint recorded as £4,446 18. This would indeed have been a remarkable fine, the equivalent of perhaps nearly 18,000 of our own money to inflict upon a small country gentleman. A long succession of historians, Cox, Worsley, Bailey, Atkinson and Edwards, have not only repeated the erroneous and absurd figure, but have expatiated in turn upon its astonishing severity. From it they have concluded that Winston must have been most exceptionally obnoxious to the Parliament, whereas actually he was very nearly overlooked in the reckoning. Striking contrasts have been drawn between the treatment of father and son, which was in fact almost identical, and Winston has been credited with a far larger share in the wars than was his due. Thus tales are told. The penalty was, however, severe for a man whose estate seems to have been worth only £160 a year. Although Winston paid his fine at the end of 1651, he did not attempt to keep an independent home. Nor did he live with his father at Wootton Glanville. There may have been other reasons besides impoverishment for this. His father had married a second time about 1643. Winston was apparently on bad terms with his stepmother, and it was to his mother-in-law rather than he turned for aid. When the ultimate judgment and compassion of the Almighty, as the victors would have expressed it, had become fully manifest throughout the West Country, Lady Drake stayed indignant on the winning side amid her ruins, and Ash House continued to be a refuge from poverty, if not from destitution, for the broken cavalier, his young wife and growing family. They do not seem to have returned home till Winston's father died in the year before Restoration. Thus they lived at Ash for 13 years, and hard must those years have been. The whole family dwelt upon the hospitality or charity of a mother-in-law of difficult, imperious and acquisitive temper, a crowded brood in a lean and war-scarred house, between them and whose owner lay the fierce contentions of the times. No record is in existence of the daily round of the composite Drake's household. We must suppose from its long continuance that family affection and sheer necessity triumphed over unspeakable differences of sentiment and conviction. Lady Drake did her duty faithfully to her daughter's family. She fed, clothed and sheltered them in such portions of her house as their partisans had left her. They, having scarcely any other resources, accepted her bounty. While Lady Drake, vaunting her fidelity, pursued her claims for compensation from the Parliament, Winston, with her aids and collusion, sought to escape its exactions. It may be that in this prolonged double effort to save as much as possible from the wreck of their affairs, a comradeship of misfortune was added to family ties. It must nonetheless have been a queer and difficult home. We may judge of their straitened means by the fact that they could not afford to put a fresh roof over the burned out parts of the house until after the restoration. They huddled together all these years in the one remaining wing. The war had impoverished the whole west countryside, and to keep up the style of gentlefolk and educate children must have imposed a severe frugality on all at Ashe. To the procreation of children and the slow excitements of frequent litigation, Winston added the relief of writing and the study of heraldry. Since Arabella had been born on the 28th of February 1649, births and deaths swiftly succeeded one another with almost annual regularity. Mrs. Winston Churchill had 12 children, of whom 7 died in infancy. The third child of these 12, and the eldest son, is the hero of this account. It is curious that no previous biographer, among so many, should have discovered the entry of his birth. A mystery has been made of it, which historians have used devious methods to solve. It is still often wrongly given. The entry in the parish register of St. Michael's, Mowsbury, reads, "John, the son of Winston Churchill, baptized, the 26th day of May, 1650. The first 10 years of his life were lived in the harsh conditions which have been suggested. We are here in the region of surmise. Facts are vague and few, but it seems easy to believe that the child grew up in a home where wants were often denied, and feelings and opinions had nearly always to be repressed. Public affairs marched forward, and their course was viewed at Ashe from standpoints separated by deep and living antagonisms. Blood and cruel injuries lay between those who gathered around the table. Outraged faith, ruined fortunes, and despairing loyalties were confronted by resolute, triumphant rebellion, and both sides were bound together by absolute dependence. It would be strange indeed if the children were not conscious of the chasm between their elders, if they never saw resentment on the one side or felt patronage from the other, if they were never reminded that it was to their grandmother's wisdom and faithful championship of the cause of Parliament they owed the bread they ate. It would be strange if the ardent cavalier, then in his prime, poring over his books of history and heraldry, watching with soured eyes the Lord Protector's victories over the Dutch or the Spaniards, and the grand position to which England seemed to have been raised by this arch wrongdoer, and dreaming of a day when the king should enjoy his own again, and the debts of royalist and regicide be faithfully and sternly settled, should not have spoken words to his little son, revealing the bitterness of his heart. The boy may well have learned to see things through his father's eyes, to long with him for a casting down of a present pride and power, and have learned at the same time, at 6, 7 and 8 years of age, not to flaunt these opinions before half at least of those with whom he lived. The two prevailing impressions which such experiences might arouse in the mind of a child would be first, a hatred of poverty and dependence, and secondly, the need of hiding thoughts and feelings from those to whom their expression would be repugnant. To have one set of opinions from one part of the family, and to use a different language to the other, may have been inculcated from John's earliest years. To win freedom from material subservience by the sure agency of money must have been planted in his heart's desire. To these was added a third, the importance of having friends and connections on both sides of a public quarrel. Modern opinion assigns increasing importance to the influences of early years on the formation of character. Certainly, the whole life of John Churchill bore the imprint of his youth. That impenetrable reserve under graceful and courteous manners, those unceasing contacts and correspondence with opponents, that iron parsimony and personal frugality, never relaxed in the blaze of fortune and abundance, that hatred of waste and improvidence in all their forms, all these could find their roots in the bleak years at Ashe. We may also suppose that Winston Churchill concerned himself a good deal with the early education of his children. From this he was not ill qualified. He had gathered, as his writings show, no inconsiderable store of historical knowledge. He presented in these years the curious figure of a cavalry captain, fresh from the wars, turned perforce recluse and bookworm. Time must have hung heavy on his hands. He had no estates to manage, no profession to pursue. He could not afford to travel, but in the teaching of his children he may well have found a like occupation and solace. Or again, he may have loafed and brooded, leaving his children to play in the lanes and gardens of that tranquil countryside. The only information we have on John's education is provided by the unknown author of the Lives of the Two Illustrious Generals, 1713. He was born in the time of the Grand Rebellion, when his father, for siding with the royal party against the usurpers, who then prevailed, was under many pressures, which were common to such an adherence to the king. Yet notwithstanding the devastations and plunderings, and other nefarious practices, the acts of cruelty which were daily committed by the licentious soldiery, no care was omitted on the part of his tender parents for a liberal and general education. For he was no sooner out of the hands of the women, but he was given into those of sequestered clergymen, who made it his first concern to instil sound principles of religion into him, that the seeds of humane literature might take the deeper root, and he, from a just knowledge of the omnipotence of the Creator, might have a true sense of the dependence of the creature. Many modern biographers of Marlborough have asserted that Richard Farrant, the rector of the neighbouring village of Mowsbury, was the clergyman here named. It would seem, however, that Farrant was no sequestered royalist, but on the contrary, a strong Puritan into whose hands Winston would hardly have let his son fall. It is said that famous men are usually the product of unhappy childhood. The stern compression of circumstances, the twinges of adversity, the spur of slights and taunts in early years, are needed to evoke that ruthless fixity of purpose and tenacious mother wit, without which great actions are seldom accomplished. Certainly little in the environment of the young John Churchill should have deprived him of this stimulus, and by various long descending channels there centred in him martial and dangerous fires. Besides attending to his son's education, Winston in his studious leisure bethought himself often of his pedigree and his arms. After accounting conscientiously several generations, Winston rested with confidence upon John, Lord of Churchill, or as 'tis in diverse records, Churchill, since called Churchill in Somersetshire, whose son, Sir Bartholomew de Churchill, a man of great note in the time of King Stephen, defended the castle of Bristol against the Empress Maud, and was slain afterward in the war. After passing through the hands of a family of the name of Jennings, of whom more later, it was sold eventually in 1652 to a Sir John Churchill, sometime Master of the Rolls, and had come to my son in right of his wife, had not been so unfortunately alienated by her said father. All this was very fine, but when descending these chains, we come to John, ancestor of the present Churchills of Munston, and Roger, who by the daughter of Peveril, relict of Nicholas Meggs, had issued Matthew, father of Jasper, my grandfather. We enter a rather shady phase. Edward Harley rudely asserts that John Churchill's great-grandfather was a blacksmith who worked in the family of the Meggs, and certainly, as his great-great-great-grandfather married a Mrs. Meggs, this seems very suspicious and even disquieting. In any case, there are strong grounds for believing that John's grandfather solidly improved the fortunes of this branch of the Churchill family. He was a practicing lawyer, a deputy registrar of Chancery, as well as a member of the Middle Temple, and lawyers were a prosperous class at this date. Not only did he make a marriage himself into an aristocratic family, the Winstons, but he seems to have arranged a step for his eldest son. For all the genealogical table produced by Winston, the Drakes were a more renowned and substantial family than the Churchills, of whom there were numerous branches of various conditions, some quite lowly, in Dorset alone, whereas John Drake's family descended 8 in line from father to son, and all called John, through the Bernard Drakes, who were already in good repute at the court of Queen Elizabeth, and passed on the properties at Mewsbury, which has now been in their hands from the 15th century. Bernard Drake had been a man of so robust quality that he had physically assaulted his relation, the renowned Sir Francis Drake, for daring to display upon his coat of arms a wyvern which he deemed poached from him. Hearing this, Queen Elizabeth conferred upon Sir Francis a wyvern dangling head downwards from the yards of a ship, and asked Sir Bernard what he thought of that. He replied with some temerity, "Madam, though you could give me a finer, yet you could not give him an ancienter coat than mine." So the marriage arranged for Winston with Lady Drake's daughter Elizabeth was socially satisfactory, and was, as we have seen, a veritable salvation during the civil wars. Another streak of blood, strange and wanton, mingled in the child John's nature. His grandmother, Lady Drake, was herself a daughter of John, Lord Beauclerk, who had married the sister of George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, the favourite of James I and Charles I. Some students have amused themselves in tracing all the men, some of the greatest and wickedest in our history, who have descended from George Villiers, father of Buckingham. They have said to have repeatedly produced, across the centuries, the favourites, male and female, of kings and queens, and Chatham and Pitt, as well as Marlborough, bear the distinction of this taint or genius. When at length at the end of her life, Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, read tardily, for it had been kept from her, Ledyard's History of the Duke, she made the following extremely up-to-date comment upon the part of the subject. This history takes a great deal of pains to make the Duke of Marlborough's extraction very ancient. That may be true for aught I know, but it is no matter whether it be true or not in my opinion, for I value nobody for another's merit. Be this as it may, students of heredity have dilated upon this family tree. Winston himself has been accounted one of the most notable and potent of sires. Had he lived the full span, he would have witnessed within the space of 12 months his son gaining the battle of Ramillies, and his daughter's son that of Almanza, and would have found himself acknowledged as the progenitor of the two greatest captains of the age at the head of the opposing armies of Britain and of France and Spain. Moreover, his third surviving son Charles became a soldier of well-tried distinction, and his naval son virtually managed the Admiralty during the years of war. The military strain flowed strong and clear from the captain of the civil wars, student of heraldry and history, and champion of the divine right. It was his blood, not his pen, that carried his message. Although in the opening chapter we have set the reader in these bygone times, 11 years of our hero's life have already been accomplished. Ash House, still unroofed, passes from the scene. Lord Worsley was keenly stirred by its remnants and their surroundings. They awoke in this brave and skillful officer memories of English glory. Surely, he exclaims, the imagination is more fired and national sentiment more roused by a visit to the spot where one of our greatest countrymen was born and passed his childhood than by any written record of his deeds. This untidy farmhouse, with its now neglected gardens and weed-choked fish ponds, round which the poor, badly clothed boy sported during his early years, seems to recall his memory, aye, even the glory with which he covered England, more vividly than a visit to Blenheim Palace, or a walk across the famous position near the village of Hochstadt on the banks of the Danube. The place, the very air, seems charged with reminiscences of the great man who first drew breath here. These scenes certainly played a curiously persistent part in John Churchill's life. It was on the very soil of his childhood, in sight almost of his birthplace, that he was in 1685 to lead the household cavalry, feeling their way towards Monmouth's army, and 3 years later on, the hill across the river, he was to meet the Prince of Orange after deserting James II. So much for Ash. But now the times are changed. Oliver Cromwell is dead. General Monk has declared for a free parliament. His troops have marched from Coldstream to Hounslow. The exiled Charles has issued the Declaration of Breda. The English people, by a gesture spontaneous and almost unanimous, have thrown off the double yoke of military and Puritan rule. Amid bonfires and their rejoicings of tumultuous crowds, they welcome back their erstwhile hunted sovereign. And by one of these intense reactions, sometimes as violent in whole nations as in individuals, changing a spasm from oppressive virtue to unbridled indulgence. On the 23rd of April 1661, Charles II was crowned at Westminster, and the restoration of the English monarchy was complete. These memorable events produced swift repercussions at Ash House. Winston Churchill passed at a stroke from the frown of an all-powerful government to the favour of a king he had faithfully served. The frozen years were over, and the Cavaliers, emerging from their retreats, walked abroad in the sun seeking their lost estates. We need not grudge him these good days. He had acted with unswerving conviction and fidelity. He had drunk to the dregs the cup of defeat and subjugation. Its traces can be seen in his anxious eyes. Now was the time of reward. Instantly, he sprang into many forms of activity. In 1661, he entered Parliament for Weymouth. In 1664, he became one of the original members of the Royal Society. Although his fortunes were much depleted, he regained his independence and a half of his own. More important than this, he stood in a modest way, high in the favour of the new regime. He was received with consideration and even intimacy at court. The terms under which Charles had returned to the kingdom were not such as to allow him to bestow wealth upon his humbler adherents. His sovereignty rested on a compromise between rebels and royalists, between Anglicans and Presbyterians, between those who had seized estates and those who had lost them, between the passions of conflicting creeds and the pride of lately hostile regiments. He had no means of meeting even the just claims which faithful subjects might urge. Still less could he satisfy the ravenous demands of long-nursed grievances or blatant imposture. Burnet says, speaking of an earlier time, the herd of the Cavalier party was now very glorious and full of courage in their cups. Though they have been very discreet managers of it in the field and in time of action, but now every one of them boasted he had killed his thousands, and were all full of merit and as full of high pretensions. It is remarkable, however, that amid the crowds of hungry and often deserving suitors who thronged the antechambers of Whitehall, so much attention should have been paid to the merits and services of Winston Churchill. Far more was done for him than for most. There was one cheap, sure way to please him. It was apparently well known. Accordingly, an augmentation of arms and a crest, unusual in a family of such standing, was offered to his heraldic propensities. Nevertheless, this evidence of a royal favour and affection was not in itself sufficiently substantial, in Winston's opinion at least, to repair the injuries he had suffered in pocket and skin. He remained cherished but disconsolate, blazoning on his new coat of arms an uprooted oak, above the motto, Fiel pero desdicado, faithful but unfortunate. More practical reliefs, as will be shown in the next chapter, were, however, in store. If you've enjoyed this first chapter of Marlborough, His Life and Times by Sir Winston S. Churchill, please drop us a like and a subscribe. Thanks for listening.